is my pleasure to introduce Jennifer Burke, a current student in the Master of Arts in Criminal Justice program. Jennifer was also a former colleague in the Center for Adult Learner Success right around the corner and is currently at Owensboro Community and Technical College,
yes,
where you are.
I'm a project manager.
A project manager. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer back to USI.
So I don't have to introduce myself because Dr. Dixon already did that. I know about half of the people sitting in this audience, so I'm going to take this as kind of a conversational time. It's not going to be a super, presentation where everything is very formal. And we are going to switch gears quite a bit. So as stated, I'm in the Master of Arts in Criminal Justice program here. And today I'm going to talk about secondary trauma and probation and parole officers and the resulting critical duties of corrections administrators. Now, I don't know how many people out here are even familiar with criminal justice studies, but I'm going to pretend like nobody is. Okay. So I have 4 objectives with this presentation. One is to talk a little bit about what probation and parole officers do. The second is to define secondary trauma. The third is to say how secondary trauma with probation and parole officers is actually a little bit different than with other helping professions. And then to talk about what corrections administrators need to do to recognize and intervene. Okay, so I am also not great with slides because I never remember to hit them. So you're going to notice that mine do not always follow. So first, I want to talk a little bit about what a probation and parole officer is and what they do. It depends on the jurisdiction. In Indiana, probation and parole is separate. Probation simply handles court cases from the county, and parole is state cases from the parole board. I worked in Kentucky, where probation and parole is together, and we both work with the county, the state together. So it is a little bit different. In a nutshell, what a probation and parole officer does every single day is they supervise individuals who are in the community who would otherwise be incarcerated. And that is a very simple explanation. But the daily duties are not simple, okay? Probation and parole officers wear a lot of different hats when they're working. A lot of times they are law enforcement officers. They have to arrest individuals on their caseload. They are counselors. They are reporters for the court and the parole board. There are a lot of different things that they have to do. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that when it comes to secondary trauma. And you'll see how that's important. So to define secondary trauma, it's also called indirect trauma. And the important thing about that is that primary trauma is something that you experience yourself, right? Secondary trauma is when you are experiencing it through someone else. So it mirrors post-traumatic stress disorder with regards to symptomology. So you may have someone who has cognitive, emotional, behavioral, or physical symptoms of PTSD, even with secondary trauma. They may be apathetic. They may develop perfectionism, guilt, anger, sadness, numbness. But what secondary trauma is it refers to the behaviors and emotions exhibited by a person who is exposed indirectly to another person's traumatic event by having to listen to or read their documents and images related to the person's traumatic experience. So you're not experiencing it for yourself, but you're reliving it through them telling about it, through looking at documents, through seeing images. And that's why it's important with probation and parole. We were talking about the duties of probation and parole. One of the things that they do every single day is prepare pre-sentence investigation reports. I don't know who knows what a pre-sentence investigation report is, but it is a very thorough document that you submit to the court prior to final sentencing for an individual. A pre-sentence investigation report, you have to go through the prosecutor's file. You have to read over police reports. Oftentimes you're going to look at photographs. Sometimes you're going to see videos. You're going to go through victim statements. There can be a lot of horrific things in that information. Now, like I said, each jurisdiction is different. When I worked in Henderson County, just across the river, I supervised a caseload of about 90 to 100 people. So keep in mind, I'm doing that every single day. And then I had to write approximately 20 PSIs every month. Now you take out weekends, that's like a PSI every single day that you're working, plus supervising 80 to 90 individuals every month, okay? So it's important to recognize how much of that indirect trauma you're being exposed to. Okay, so as part of my research, and I want to mention this before I get to this, I looked at a lot of literature reviews. You guys are all students, so you do that as well. When you're reviewing the literature and you're looking at the research, sometimes you notice a few things, you know, that might be in there and you're kind of like, what's going on with this? So I noticed in the research that secondary trauma appeared to coexist with other mental health issues. Now that makes a lot of sense, actually, okay? If someone's experiencing secondary trauma, it makes sense that they would show symptomology for other mental health issues. Now, I did notice that there was a researcher and she was involved in 4 studies around the same time frame. So it was about 2016 to 2018. She had 4 different studies, but they were separated out: secondary trauma, organizational climate with regards to mental health, role conflict, and mental health within probation and parole. And I noticed that when I was reading the studies, that she had the same amount of officers in every single study. And I thought that was kind of strange. So I talked to Dr. Callahan, who was my professor for this particular class. And he was like, well, it sounds like, you know, they talked to the same people and they just wrote 4 different papers. So I reached out to the researcher. Kind of strange. I don't know how many of you have ever done that, but it was very odd. But I reached out to her. She's an associate professor at the University of Northern Iowa. Her name is Dr. Gail. I'm going to get this wrong now after I've practiced it all day. Anyway, her last name is Dunn. She has a hyphenated name. Anyway, she reached back out. It was kind of weird. But she told me that yes, they were actually doing a research project on secondary trauma with probation and parole. And as they were doing that, they noticed that mental health, organizational climate issues, all of these other things coexisted with secondary trauma. Now, just because you have issues with secondary trauma doesn't mean you're going to have these other issues. And just because you have these other issues doesn't mean, but they do appear to coexist. So they write 4 separate papers on ultimately the same research project. Okay. And that's good to know. So why are we seeing an enhancement in secondary trauma with probation and parole officers now? Part of the reason is because of the shifting roles of probation and parole officers. So there has been a huge shift in the last, I would say 8 to 10 years to evidence-based practices. Now, evidence-based practices is a term that is not alone with criminal justice. It goes across various other issues, but evidence-based practices is about, you know, empirical evidence, right? And evidence-based practices, it's a good thing. That's what we want, right? We want to have everything that we're doing for these individuals to be based on evidence. We want to help these people. We don't want them to go back to jail. Okay, so the problem is we went from simply just monitoring their compliance, having them come in, sit with us for a few minutes and making sure that they're not committing crime, making sure that they're living where they're living, making sure that they're abiding by their conditions, to actually being agents of behavioral change. When that happens, you're building rapport with these individuals. You're doing really in-depth assessments with them. You're getting to know them. And when you do that, you're hearing and you're reading and you're being exposed to more of what they have to say and what they've been through. So you're getting that secondary trauma exposure. Now, Also, with that shifting role is the dual job expectations. So you're supporting the treatment efforts because ultimately that's what we want to do. We want to support everyone's treatment efforts. We want to get them in the appropriate programs. We want them to be productive members of society. But we also have the mission statement of every probation and parole agency. It doesn't matter where you are in the country, right? We want to assist these individuals. We want to reintegrate them into society. We want them to be productive members of society. But we also have a mission to always have public safety in mind. We have to protect public safety. So even though we have to walk this one line over here where we're supporting treatment efforts and we're giving them everything that we have, on this other side, we still have to police their behaviors. We still have to do that while we're facing dangerous situations. We still have to make sure that they're compliant. So we have those dual job expectations that kind of throw a wrench in there. So when I conducted the literature review and talked to Dr. Gail Reinberger Dunn, remembered her name, thank you. Some of the key findings of the studies regarding mental health of officers in secondary trauma. So the more contact with an offender or the more exposure to their trauma, the more likely an officer is to report secondary trauma. That makes sense, right? This is all about exposure. We talked about that. However, the age, years of experience, gender, education, training, veteran status had no effect on those findings. It was just the exposure. That's how secondary trauma works. The more you're exposed, the more likely you're to develop secondary trauma. Now, on the flip side of that, we were talking about how sometimes mental health and organizational climate factors coexist with secondary trauma. So emotional exhaustion, burnout, and role conflict appeared to be significant predictors of depressive symptoms. So, multiple roles, high caseloads that are ever changing, all of this with the possibility of secondary trauma. Probation and parole officers, that's difficult, right? How are they going to maintain? How are they going to continue to provide the services that they need to provide and maintain public safety? And ultimately, that's what it's about, right? Because if we don't take care of our officers, they can't take care of the community. So now we're going to look at organizational climate as a consideration. We just saw on the last slide, we talked about role conflict. I'm going to start there. So role conflict is the compliance with one set of pressures, making compliance with another set difficult, objectionable, or impossible. In a nutshell, it's difficult to choose one thing over the other, right? Role ambiguity is another issue, a lack of clarity regarding your roles and your responsibilities, role overload, stress for too much to do, not enough time to get it done in. Emotional exhaustion and burnout is another one that was really stressed, which is a syndrome of emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and reduced personal accomplishment that can lead to deterioration of services. And that's what I just mentioned. If the services are deteriorated, then public safety is at risk. The effects of unrecognized and untreated trauma in officers. So if probation and parole officers go on with no recognition, no intervention, they can have depressive symptomology, excessive absenteeism, reduced effectiveness in the field, reduced positive outcomes. And again, that's the big one. Because if they're not effective in the field and they don't have positive outcomes with the offenders that they're supervising, not only are the offenders being, they're in trouble, public safety is in trouble. Physical health symptoms, ultimately resignation, also negative relationships at home and home issues. Okay, so what are we going to do about it? What can we do about it? It's all about recognition and intervention. Administrators are the key to recognition. So there can be an assessment tool that is developed to try to recognize the symptomology in probation and parole officers. And I say that, and the reason I thought of this was because in 2012, I was actually an officer that was part of a study for a graduate student at Western Kentucky University for PTSD symptoms, not for secondary trauma exactly, but for PTSD symptoms. And it was an interesting tool. And although we never found out the results, we talked amongst ourselves. And I think that it would be a very good tool to have, possibly an annual assessment tool to determine if anybody's exhibiting any kind of symptoms of secondary trauma. There needs to be education and training within the agency about what secondary trauma is, how to notice it yourself and others, and what you can do about it. They have to provide access to resources. If you're going to assess, and you're going to educate, and you're going to train, you have to provide the resources, right? And these last three, I think, all go together. I'm going to talk a little bit about leadership styles and promotions within the agency. This is something nobody wants to talk about. Okay, so there are many different leadership styles. And in the program, we went over several. I kind of combined them into three different types. Authoritarian, which everybody probably already knows what that is. It's somebody who is kind of like a military style, gets in there, doesn't really care what you have to say about anything, rule follower, wants everything to be done the way they want it to be done, okay? The others I kind of combined into a couple of different categories. Transactional is someone who is a little bit better than authoritarian, right? You do a good job, they're going to reward you for it. You don't do a good job, you're going to be punished for it. I don't know, I guess that could work. The third one is transformational. Transformational sounds good, it is good. So they're inspiring, they help to motivate, they have an open door policy, they have the same goals and missions as their employees, and they just want everything to be great, but they want the job to get done. Everybody wants the job to get done. So that is the type of leader. The other two, maybe not leaders, right? Supervisors. So that type of leader is someone that you want to look for when you're hiring, when you're promoting, and they're going to promote self-care with their employees, which I never had in the 20 years I worked. I did have when I came to USI. Just want to say that. But they can also foster a safe and supportive work environment. And that's what you have to have whenever you're working in a dangerous, stressful job environment. At this point, I would say the world is changing, not always for the better. Everyone sees it, and it's in everyone's life. But when agencies and institutions fail to change with the world, bad things happen. I think that corrections administrators have a duty to foster a safe and supportive work environment, to change what is going on within their agencies. And even especially with these types of agencies where any kind of coming out and saying, you know, I need help is seen as a weakness, that needs to change. And that's it. Anybody have any questions?
Hello. I have a question. So you mentioned the caseload, your typical was 90 to 100. Is that standard for everyone? And how is that sustainable?
So that is not standard. Henderson County is a small, what they call a satellite office. Is this on? I think I did something to it. I think I did something to the microphone. I'm sorry. So that is not sustainable, even at that number. So Henderson County was a satellite office, a field office, and that number is even high. So they say that it should be between 60 and 70 for any officer. I then moved to Davis County, which is Owensboro. It's a much larger area than Henderson. And I usually have between 120 and 150 cases, which is double what you're supposed to have. But that's why it's important to invest in the officers that you have, Because if you have burnout and you have people resigning and you have people leaving, you can't sustain a department that way. And when you have role overload, okay, when you're short-staffed, you can't sustain supervising that many cases. Anybody else? No? All right,
Thank you so much.
thank you.